And we are live. Good morning, Carrie. Always faithful Carrie. Carrie's always the first one here. And see who else shows up. Robin, another faithful friend. Robin, good morning, all. Happy New Year. It is the 2nd of 2025, which is unbelievable, but here we are. So I wanted this morning, AC. How are you, AC? Good to see you. This morning, I thought the big news of the last week or so, obviously Jimmy Carter dying, 100 years old. Not bad. Not bad at all for someone, especially living at that time. I guess I won't be doing any audio. So my thoughts, I wanted to talk about Jimmy Carter because he was a very important person in my life. In a lot of ways, he was an important person to anyone in my generation, just because we are still feeling the effects of what he did and what he didn't do in office and even afterwards. So just the story is in 1976, he ran for president. I was 16 at the time. We had just been through Watergate, and Watergate was the most overblown thing I think ever in my life. And it was just nonstop. You couldn't, everything was Watergate all the time. I remember an episode when I just said Watergate. There was an episode of All in the Family where Archie and Meathead come in, and Meathead just keeps talking about Watergate, and Archie says, "I don't want to hear about Watergate." And so Meathead goes, Watergate. It was just the liberal mindset back then was to just keep hammering on that. I remember the Watergate hearings were on all the time. And this was when I was in junior high. And so it was basically the media. Watergate was the first time the media, I think, was out of control in this country. Maybe in Vietnam, they were getting out of control. But the reporting on Vietnam. So anybody else out there have any memories? Chloe made it. Hey, you did. Everybody's recovering from New Year's. I hope everybody. Here we go. Robin, I keep thinking about, and I don't know why, is that photograph of the Carters and the Bidens, how the Bidens were gigantic and the cars were tiny. Obviously a Photoshopped incident. That's interesting. I didn't see that one, but yeah. So, and I think it's very interesting. After someone dies, you don't want to speak ill of the dead, and that's a good thing. It really is a good thing. But recovering from New Year's, I assume it's just staying up late and being tired. I'm going to assume that's what we all did. So certainly we didn't even my wife and I didn't even make it. She was sick and she went to bed. So I went to bed too. I had too many times in my life where I celebrated New Year's alone. So I didn't want to, I think I told Michael yesterday, I didn't want to be a dog returning into its vomit and that. Robin, was he important because he handed over the Panama Canal for $1? That's one of them. That's one of the things we're still living with. And it's in the news now because Trump wants to take back the Panama Canal. So many things. There were so many things. But getting back to Watergate, the reason I talk about Watergate was the press was out of control. It was get Richard Nixon. And that was really what it was. And I was too young to quite understand why. it's funny. My first president of living memory is Lyndon Johnson, and then it was Richard Nixon, and then it was Gerald Ford for a little bit. And then there was the very fresh memory of John F. Kennedy being assassinated. But by the time I was aware of what was going on, right around the end of President Johnson's term, everybody hated the president. They hated Lyndon Johnson. They hated Richard Nixon. And then when Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, they hated him. So everybody hated the president, in my view. And then they shot the one before Johnson. So as far as I knew, it was an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, whatever it was. I was like, that, they just don't. Presidents are either shot or they're hated. I mean, people trying to be president. Bobby Kennedy was shot. I remember that, and killed because he wanted to be president. George Wallace was running for president. He got shot. So my view of the presidency was like, who would want this job? You always say, when you're a little kid, my dad's going to be president someday. I wouldn't have wanted my dad to be president because I was sure he would have been shot. So that's just what happen to presidents. They either get shot or they're hated, right? So Richard Nixon basically resigns, and Gerald Ford's there, and Gerald Ford is just a bumbling, kind of incompetent guy. I guess he was a good enough political guy in Washington, but he was on the Warren Commission, which a lot of people didn't like. So Chloe, you remember that? Okay. I was 3 years old. So, and Chloe's, I remember Watergate. Yes. I won't talk about that today. And then Chloe, I'll speak a little bit. I guess being almost 70, I just speak the truth. I tell people, write your truth as you wish it to be your history. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's a little conflicted time here with Carter dying because he came into office because everybody was fed up with Washington, D.C. and the people that everybody knew, and nobody knew him. And he was this kind of really genteel, nice, kind of everyman peanut farmer who I never even heard of a peanut. I never even thought, but I guess people have to farm peanuts. I always thought farming was carrots and whatever, wheat. But I guess, yeah, to get my peanut butter every morning, somebody has to grow those peanuts, right? So it was just anybody but these crooks in Washington. These crooks that gave us Vietnam and that gave us Watergate, we're fed up with it. So in comes this guy, and people are like, why not just change? It was really, to me, it was the first major irresponsible kind of childish thing that the American public did, because it was, looking back, it was so clear that this man was not up to the job. I mean, good for him for, his accomplishments, coming from that little small town in Georgia, with a goofball brother. I don't know if anybody remembers Billy Carter and Billy Beer, but he was just Southern, poor. I don't know if you would call it, I would hate to call it white trash, but a friend of mine would probably call it that, who's from the South. And that he didn't go to Yale, obviously. He didn't go to Harvard. He wasn't Ivy League. He wasn't from the swamp, what we would call now the swamp. And so it was just, and he was a media creation in a lot of ways. And part of it was Gerald Ford's bumbling about talking about communism not being a problem or whatever. And even Carter said that. So it was just a mix-up time. The 70s were a mixed-up, crazy time. So, and when he came into office, it was just obvious from the start that he was incompetent. And it was almost good that he was in office, because what he did was he put an end to the 70s. In his 4 years, the country saw what a mistake we made, and then they made. Wasn't voting back then, but I would have probably voted for him because I was a Democrat in my misspent youth. So I did vote for him again in 1980. Believe it or not, I voted for Jimmy Carter. That was my first presidential vote. I voted for Jerry Brown for governor, I think my vote in 1978. And then I voted for Jimmy Carter. People can't believe that now. I might have even voted for Mondale in 1984 because I was, like I said, I was a Democrat back then. And I always tell people the only reason I was a Democrat back then was because my dad was a Republican, because I knew much more than my dad. I mean, good grief. Child of Chicago gangsters who survived the Depression and then went to World War II and got a ship shot out from under him and barely got out. Purple Heart, came back, started a business, started a family, raised 4 relatively decent contributors to society. Was one of the major architects of the city I grew up in, founding father of that city, highly respected businessman. What does he know? I knew everything because I watched TV or whatever it is. So if I went in that voting booth, I saw that there was an R next to my dad's name. There was going to be a D next to mine because I knew. So, but what the saying is, the older you get, the smarter your parents get, right? So we got some chimes. So I voted for the man twice. Jimmy Carter was the worst president in all U.S. history until Biden, period. If he's dead and that's the story, it's true. And I'm speaking. So be it, truth. Okay. That's a little harsh, but okay. Panama Canal, Robin. Over 38,000 Americans died building that canal so we could have trade egress with the rest of the world. And he just handed it over for $1. Yeah, pretty much. And I didn't get it at the time. I didn't get what that all was about. I guess I was thinking it's Panama's, land. Why not? Robin again. Lyndon Johnson was dirty. Boy, was he. He was nothing to be proud of. He reversed President Kennedy's decision to stay out of Vietnamese Civil War. We had no business there. Yeah. And Jimmy Carter was a bad president, but compared to Lyndon Johnson, he was not. Lyndon Johnson did more damage to this country than not only legacy of Vietnam, but the war on poverty and the Great Society just finished the job that Roosevelt started with the New Deal, but it took it to a whole new level. The amount of destruction and misery and pain that this country has survived since Lyndon Johnson, and because of what Lyndon Johnson did, dwarfs Jimmy Carter. Okay. U.S. has no business being most of what they are. I assume, Carrie, you mean foreign wars and things like that. Okay, Robin. Gerald Ford couldn't stand upright. Every picture of Gerald Ford, he was either on the ground or in the process of heading to the ground. That's what I remember as a small child. You may have been watching Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live. I don't know, but I think Chevy Chase gave himself permanent back injury by playing Gerald Ford. If you've never seen it, Google it. Every time he plays Gerald Ford, he falls down. There was a famous time when Ford fell over. But that was it. That's what the presidents were before him. Okay. We were just recovering from the shock of Kennedy being assassinated. Johnson escalated Vietnam. That was a trauma. Watergate was a created trauma to me. I mean, yeah, Nixon did some things, but the things that Nixon did, he did because everybody forgets this. When Kennedy and Nixon ran in 1960, it's pretty well established that Kennedy stole that election. And Nixon didn't do a thing for the good of the countries. So he had that experience, and he was not going to let the Democrats do that again. So that's why he did the things he did in Watergate, not justifying them, but compared to what the Clintons did all these years later with the FBI files and classified documents, what Nixon did was bad, but it did not warrant the entire country going through what the press and the political class put us through. But that was, again, that was leading up to Jimmy Carter. And I also had a thought that Jimmy Carter was the Alan Alda of presidents. He was the first sensitive man president. He was a Christian. And that was one thing. When he first came out, he made a big deal about his Christian faith. And it seemed to me it was orthodox. As I remember it, and I was reading now, he did have a good evangelical faith, Southern Baptist, but it was kind of the last, it was kind of that last period, probably of 20, 30, 40 years where the mainline denomination churches were going very progressive and very liberal. So he got caught up in a lot of the socially progressive stances that were pulling those mainline denominations leftward. And that's where, especially on stuff like life issues, lifestyle issues, say. So I think he, like I said, he put an end to that kind of thinking in as being dominant, because he was the last thing that told us we can't keep going this direction. And he was the last thing needed for that conservative wave to come and for Ronald Reagan to be elected, because Reagan, did run against Gerald Ford for the nomination in 76 and he just came short. See the movie Reagan if you guys haven't. It does a very good job with Dennis Quaid. But by the 1980 election, people had it. Not only with the Panama Canal, the hostage crisis, which was probably the biggest thing. The Iran hostage crisis was such a bad thing. Oh my Lord. And that was kind of the last nail saying, hey, America can't go on like this. We can't give away the Panama Canal. We can't have our hostages, our citizens being held hostage by some podunk country, and then had to do this lame military rescue that showed how incompetent the military was. And Billy Beer. Here's somebody say something about Billy Beer. Your dad had a can of Billy Beer. No way. Okay, Billy Beer, for those of you who don't know, was Billy Carter, his brother. His brother was the ultimate redneck. It was embarrassing. So let's see, Billy Beer. That's funny. They tried to say that Billy Carter was an embarrassment to brothers. Yeah, I don't know about that. He was probably just a normal guy. Well, I mean, define normal. He was the prototypical Deep South redneck, which is maybe normal. But yes, but he didn't. Who thought his brother would become president? His brother was the governor of Georgia, which I'm sure was an embarrassment too. But when Carter became president, it just upped it to a pretty much higher scale, put it that way. So he was like the first of the sensitive man, and everybody had enough of it. And the energy crisis, when he got on TV and kind of scolded America and he actually said the people who were cold, who were having trouble heating their homes because of the high cost of energy, he says, quit complaining, just put on a sweater. And I think he had a cardigan sweater or something. And he kind of said there's this malaise, which was a very good word for the 70s, malaise. There was a psychological condition in the country where everyone was just down on America and down on each other. And it was just kind of this post-hippie 60s hangover, I guess, where everyone was just like, life sucked in the 70s. It really did, in a lot of ways. And that's what I grew up in. And that's all I knew. So when sunny, positive Ronald Reagan came in saying, "Hey, America," he was the first "Make America Great Again" guy. And I was talking to Michael yesterday about how this current period we're in is much like from Biden to Trump is a lot like Carter to Reagan, where people had seen the fruits of what started in the 60s and said, no more. We've got to get back to where America is a great place. And people are optimistic. Things went from, in my mind, things went from kind of dark and wood paneled shag carpet in the 70s to bright, optimistic, sunny. I think the media went that way. Videos, films were much brighter in the 80s. Things were just more optimistic. It's funny, just the mood of the country changed, the look of things. And I just didn't think it could be that way. I thought everything was just kind of pressing and cynical. I didn't think you could be optimistic. I thought it was corny. I thought Reagan was corny, right? So, okay, I've got to catch up on comments here. So, and that's all the way led up to when Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Because that was another thing. We thought communism, half the world was enslaved when I was a kid, and just thought it would always be that way. And till Reagan said, "Hey, tear down this wall. Why does things have to be this way? And that you can do something about it. This is America still, right?" So, Chloe, Carrie, I was in Iran for a month prior to the hostage mess. That movie rocked my world. Look, that would mean Argo, right? The movie is Argo. Somebody said they saw Argo. Argo is a good movie to watch. It caught that time very well. So, yeah. Supposed to be weather with coolest broom. Yeah, boy, was it ever dangerous. Wow. You were there a month prior to that. That's a life-changing break for you, wasn't it, Chloe? So, yeah. So afterwards, after his presidency, Carter, again, it was. I remember afterwards, Carter just being shocked that he could lose, and whatever appeal he had as president. I guess part of it, his work with Habitat for Humanity was good, and most people remember that, and that was his legacy after his presidency, and a lot of people will say that that's what made him a great ex-president. Which is, he went back to Plains, Georgia. He didn't go for a lot of money. He didn't, do the things that ex-presidents do a lot of times. But for him to put his energies into building houses for homeless people, or for poor people, or whatever Habitat does, was a great thing. I wish he would have just kept it with that. I wish he would have stayed out of other presidents' business. He was very detrimental to what George Bush was trying to do. George H.W. Bush was trying to do in Kuwait, to get Saddam out of Kuwait. He hindered that. I know he hindered what Bill Clinton was trying to do in North Korea. He sabotaged that. And a lot of people think that that's why North Korea has nukes now. And we have Jimmy Carter to thank for that. His stance on Israel, the best thing he did was probably during his presidency was the Israel and Egypt peace accords, Camp David Accords. That was something else, because that was another thing I never thought would happen. When I was a kid, Egypt and Israel were always at war. But he met with them, and he got them a genuine peace treaty. I will give him that. Egypt and Israel, their peace lasted almost 50 years. That's amazing. And Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt then, and Menachem Begin was the president of Israel. Sadat paid the ultimate price for that. he got assassinated because he made peace with Israel. So, but I think that gave him the idea that he was this somehow super diplomat or whatever. I'm not sure, but he kept interfering. And it's funny, for a guy who negotiated peace between Egypt and Israel, he didn't have much of a very good view of Israel, which I don't understand. He called it an apartheid state, and he's undermined a lot of what Israel's trying to do just to stay alive and to exist. I don't quite get that. For someone who was inside in those negotiations, he knows what's going on there. He knows what Israel's up against, and for him to try and undermine them and call them apartheid or whatever is he's definitely tarnished his international reputation. He could have left, and he could have left that alone. That peace accord alone would have sealed him as a great. That would have been a great thing, a great legacy for him. But he's tarnished it ever since by interfering and letting it go to his head. So, yeah, Lyndon Johnson is a reason we have the government state and no men and homes destroyed by American family. Yeah, I can't argue with that. That is exactly what the Great Society did. And he famously, Lyndon Johnson famously said he'll have the N-word people voting Democrat for 200 years. It was the worst thing I think a president's ever said. Lyndon Johnson was a horrible human being, and he did horrible things to this country. And like I said, that was Jimmy Carter was the last of that really depressing, destructive time that I will say started when Kennedy stole the election. The Kennedy family stole the election with the help of who, in you know who are these guys. So, but in one sense, like I said, he was the last of a time, and he was the first of a time and the last. He was the first time we said, "Hey, we want someone outside the bubble, the Beltway, to kind of come in." I guess maybe you could argue that Eisenhower was that because he came from the military, but still, he was part of the government machine, because the military is obviously a government agency. The biggest probably. So, but it's funny. We'll have the funerals. We'll have him lying in state in the Capitol, and world leaders will come and pay their respects, which should be. I mean, he was the president of the United States, and it was I got to give it to him for him to become president, but it had to be at the right time. He had to be at the right place at the right time, and he did the right things to become president. Too bad he just wasn't up for the job. And his worldview, even though he is a Christian, he was letting a non-Christian worldview take over with him. And it not only affected his presidency, I think it affected his life after that. And he is kind of the ultimate, to me, what mainstream Christian, mainline Christian man. He knew the truth. He was a Christian, but he was letting these progressive ideas take his eye off the ball, put it that way. And in the debates with Reagan, all he ever said was, "I'm going to create a new government agency to deal with this problem and that problem." And Reagan, who was not necessarily an evangelical Christian, said, "There you go again. There you go again. See, all President Carter can think of to solve problems is another big government solution with more tax money and more waste and more loss of freedom." And so that kind of, to me, sums up that juxtaposition of an evangelical man who's losing his worldview and a non-evangelical man. Maybe Reagan was probably more of a mainline denomination guy too, but he was saying that's not the solution. Government is not the God. Let people go to God for their needs, and let them free Americans so they can act on their faith and their conscience. So that's about all it is. Thanks for all I've got. And I will probably see you tomorrow with Ben and Michael. again, Happy New Year. Thanks, guys, for tuning in for the comments. I appreciate it. We will